This is a presentation I was meant to give a few years ago, back in 2012 actually, while the international Nazis called up the hall. I had my presentation cancelled. They were members of a comet debt cult based in France, and their cult leader told them to call the place up and to explain to them how I was a terrible person, blah 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 blah, and how they would boycott and cause all this trouble. And the actual talk was cancelled. Now, this group also run a so-called alternative news site, which they claim to be as unbiased. It's not unbiased. They get messages from the cult leader, who is an alien living on another constellation in the future. So that's how unbiased they are. They're crazed fascists with no souls. And it was ironic that they had this presentation cancelled, because the presentation was really about people like them. People who claim to be spiritual but are pathological and have no souls, and they join cults. And the reason why they join cults is because they have a lack of soul. There's a fundamental breakdown, or shall we say lack of depth, to their personality structure. Now, this presentation is not necessarily about people like that. It's about the idea of having a soul, the idea of having a depth of consciousness that's apparent to people. We've all met people who we can relate to, that we can say to ourselves, like, this person has a very old or a very deep soul, regardless of their age. At the same time, too, in terms of New Agers, comet debt cult members, and individuals like that, you can see that they have no souls. You just have to look at the main fanatics. There's a deadness in their eyes. There's a lack of vitality in their speech. There's a monotonal expression of their consciousness. You can see it in their eyes. It's almost like you're waiting for drool to come out the side of their lips. It's also compensated by the fact that they tend to lunge and jump when they're trying to make a point, because there's such a disbelief in their own spirituality, that they claim to possess their own spiritual identity, that they have to kind of enforce it by jumping and jumping. And really what this presentation is about is what I call the untilled soul, like the soul that has not been properly cultivated and harvested. Now, that's not to say that people who lack a kind of a depth of soul are something wrong with them. They just may not be ready for the engagement with spiritual ideas that they think they are, and therefore they jump to all kinds of cures and panaceas and answers to this. Now, a lot of this has to do with where you grow up. If you grow up in a kind of a well-grounded sort of peasant, and I mean that in quotations, a peasant environment, or a sort of a rich working class, or a rich identity, a sense of self, an intellectual middle class, upper middle class family, where there's a strong belief in the narrative and the spoken world, you're less likely to have this identity where you need to find yourself, where you have to find the meaning of life, what it's about. A peasant in the west coast of Ireland, Portugal, a Native American, a Japanese person who lives in the countryside, an Indian who's not a Brahmin, will probably automatically have this, and they feel no need to go on a spiritual journey as such. Whereas someone who grows up, not their own fault, there's nothing to do with it's an accident of birth, who grows up in sort of bland American suburbia, where there's only the shopping mall and the multiplex cinema, there's a lack of soul to their environment. So they go on a spiritual journey to find themselves. A beautiful thing, a worthy and noble thing, but very often filled with pitfalls, such as cults and so on. Born again religious mania, Christianity mania. I'll give you an example of that. I was in suburban Atlanta about 10, 15 years ago in the USA, and to my amazement, I was in the suburb that was nothing but what they call storefront churches. They were all scout halls, shops, and even houses along this long strip that had been converted into churches. This is not spirituality, this is not the development of the soul. This is almost like a McDonald's version of religion. So you go to the Pentecostal church of the first day saints, and then you go next, when you get fed up with that, you go down 3 blocks down and you join the church of the everlasting assumption, or whatever their silly names are. And this is a huge problem, because we have people who were born into these soulless places, and with transhumanism and so on, etc., increasing, this will happen more and more and more, and therefore people need to be very careful of the pitfalls. Now, why do people have this need for a spiritual journey, a spiritual expression of themselves? A lot of the time it comes from things like life crisis. They may have had a death in the family, a nervous breakdown, the death of a child, a divorce, the breakup in a relationship, various things that may cause them to go on this journey. There's a lack of faith in the world around them, and therefore they need to find something to mend or to acquiesce this pain inside them. There's also the belief in something higher to explain mysteries. This would be the idea of gaps in science, things that are very strange to someone. You would have the UFO and the comet death cults be out of people like this. They're looking for answers to things that science can't explain. So you'd have cult leaders jumping in and explaining the mysteries to them. A lack of satisfaction in current life choices. I saw this a lot when I worked in corporate life. You had like men and women who had actually been very successful, gone through the whole education, corporate career thing, and were not happy. It just didn't work out for them, and so they're looking for meaning. You have the psychedelic or the magical experience aspect of this kind of need, and these people would be more like hippie inclined, more ones taking entheogens, looking towards a Terence McKenna kind of magical experience. People who join modern neo-pagan or druid groups, again, just trying to make their lives more, shall we say, colourful and interesting. There's also a very powerful one, is this need to rationalize social, economic or political dysfunctionality. This is very understandable, very common, that people look around the world and they don't know, and this is one of the reasons I jumped in onto this movement and to try explain these things, that you have these psychopaths who are running the system. People would look around, they were probably part of a political party, realize that the politicians were scumbags and so on, and they need to find something deeper and much, much more, shall we say, to validate their passion. Then you have the dogmatic institutionalization, people who are raised as like Catholics or fundamental Protestants, Orthodox Jews and so on, Muslims. They have been so indoctrinated with the idea of religion as a central focus in their lives that they cannot accept their lives without this religious dogma. At some level they have to believe in something. In terms of the need, there's some very, very powerful things can jump us to the next level. Now these are not necessarily bad things, they're often very good things, because they cause us to take pause, to correct ourselves, to understand ourselves better. The death of a loved one is a very common one, a death of a pet that they're very close to, a death of a family member, the death of someone that they worked with, they were friends with, and this can be a shock. This is almost like a shock to the system that can cause this need. Emotional turmoil. There's people who, everything from chemical imbalances to an abusive childhood, have all these emotional turmoils inside them, and they need to kind of find a point, a fixative of sorts, to glue themselves into something that will help, without actually using chemicals, to medicate that turmoil. The midlife crisis is another one. I think I actually went through that myself, though I think I was born with a midlife crisis in some ways, like so many of us. And this is, some people say it's an opportunity. It is a chance to reset and start again. But the midlife crisis thing is very, very interesting, because it happens when you've run the gauntlet, and then you say, I've had enough, I'm looking for something. And it may start out by recorrecting yourself with something as innocent as yoga classes even, and that may lead to other things. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but again, we have to be careful of the pitfalls and the parasites, the cults and so on, who try to jump into that. Relationships ending is a very, very common one that causes people to have this kind of psychic or consciousness awakening. A divorce and so on. At the end of all the chemicals brought about by love and romance suddenly being cut off like that will do that. Addictions issues is one of the sort of black magic aspects of it. A lot of alcoholics and junkies will end up in things like Jehovah's Witnesses, the Pentecostal churches and so on like that. And it's not really addressing anything, it's just compensating. It's one addiction for the other. And then sudden vulnerability, insecurity, status loss. You could have, I always think of that Woody Allen film, that scene, that Woody Allen film Manhattan, where he's obsessed with that. He thinks he has a brain tumor, and when he discovers he hasn't a brain tumor, he runs out of the doctor's office dancing and singing and everything, and then he suddenly stops and goes, oh my god, one day I'm going to die. And sudden vulnerability is like that. We can suddenly realize that, oh my god, my life has been bullshit to this point. What's it all about? And then there's the need to want to believe. This need to, there has to be more than this. There has to be more than the material world. Yes, that's a very strong thing, understandable, necessary, and a very philosophical idea that just about even people who are not very well educated will actually incorporate into their worldview. It's almost like an innate basic human function, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with it. There's also the idea of what's the purpose of my life, what's the purpose of life in general. They switch on the TV news and they see all these horrors happening, all this misery going on, and they say to themselves, well, what's the purpose of it? What's the purpose of life? Again, understandable. Now, the idea of life after death is an interesting one. There's two ways of looking at this. On one level, you have a kind of a longing to be reunited with the ones you love. Again, very powerful, very strong. It's been a maxim of human existence forever. There's also the narcissistic element of that creeps in. Is like, I don't deserve to die, I'm too good to die. This is where the cults jump in and say, there's no such thing as death. Follow me, do what I say, and you'll ascend to the fifth density and all this other crap. And that's also another pitfall. But it's an interesting one in the sense that it's also a spur to greatness. If you look on the idea of like, okay, is there life after death? If you concentrate too much on that, you forget that, is there a purpose to my life while I'm living? There's an ignorance of philosophy, psychology, and scientific reason. This is a massive one. Jesus will save me. There'll be a rapture. There'll be common clusters one day. There will be Ascension 2012 and all this nonsense. And no, it's just you don't realize, or people don't pay attention to the fact that this is the story of history, all through history and all through the world. And there's an ignorance of a greater understanding of themselves that leads to this. There was a great sketch that Peter Cook, that genius British comedian from the 60s and 70s did, where everyone was standing on a mountain waiting for the end of the world. And as the end of the world didn't happen, the guy Peter Cook goes, okay lads, see you next week. There's an understanding of the understanding of philosophy and psychology is just not there. They don't know why they're drawn to that. Then the appeal of the supernatural, a fantastic one, where people may say, I want to go to a seance and talk to some medium, and see if he can help me contract my Aunt Ethel and so on. And it's very powerful, but these cold readings can be very deceptive. But they also, again, generate that the purpose of life thing, or the life after death thing, where they have you concentrating on the next world rather than this one. And that brings us to the externalization of personal potential, where you need a guru to tell you what to do. And you have all these silly people who are often very highly educated saying, well, my spiritual teacher is scientifically validated. No, they aren't. They've just done a cold reading. They've just done a gaslighting on you to make you think that, because you think you're too clever or too educated to be suckered in by a charlatan with a Ouija board, a crystal ball, or, you know, channeling. There's also the lack of satisfaction in life, this sense of like achieving everything, having everything, and you know, not this specifically desiring anything beyond your basic means of survival. It's like they used to say, depression is a middle class disease. There's a lot of truth to that. The more the poorer people are, the less they have this need of satisfaction. They tend to accept life in its reality and what it is. They're more fatalistic and less materialistic. When people achieve more, earn money, they become very dissatisfied on a spiritual level. This is why Scientology and all these other groups jump in there, because they're taking all these people who've achieved everything, played the game, and in terms of their soul, they've gained absolutely nothing. And they've also played the game and disappointed, it doesn't work out, and then sexual, you know, banging all the women they want, getting all the money they want, having all the fast cars they want, it will not deliver. We see that in movies like Eyes Wide Shut and The Ninth Gate and The Devil Rides Out and To the Devil a Door. There are all these movies dealing with the idea of these super rich people who, it's not enough. It's never enough, and it's like spiritual boredom, and they are burnt out. Other people develop the need through a magical experience. I think many of us have had these sort of magical experiences. If you're an atheistic minded person or an agnostic minded person, you tend to rationalize them away as being something that happened you don't fully understand, or their grief, neurons firing. You always remember that movie, that very good movie with Mel Gibson, the Signs, where he talks about he's an ex-minister who's rationalizing the death of his wife in a stupid car accident, and the wife says something like, swing away, and he just said, oh, that was just the motor neurons in our brain firing. But then again, it turns out by the end of the movie to be a magical experience. You have Maslow's peak experience. I've never experienced this, but I know people who have, and it's something I would love to experience. It's just the idea of like when you suddenly have this shock to your baseline consciousness, and you realize that everything is connected. There's no drugs involved, nothing. It's just like this incredible story that unfolds before you, and the narrative is pure magic and pure connectedness. The stories of women who are washing dishes and looking out their kitchen towards their child playing in the garden, and suddenly they'll have this peak experience. Colin Wilson speaks of a time that the great British author Colin Wilson speaks of a time where he was trapped in the English countryside in an intense snowstorm, and he had to get out, otherwise he would starve or freeze to death. And he drove down this country lane that was like a road that was like very narrow, and there was ditches 6 foot down on each side, that if he went off an inch to the left or an inch to the right, his car would have fallen into the ditch, and he would have been killed, because he would have no chance of rescue in this intense snowstorm. He was so concentrated on getting to the end, getting to the main road down this country lane without being killed, that he began to have a psychedelic experience. He began to experience the trees as different colours, as the reality as different colours. Near-death experiences are also very common. I had a friend years ago who nearly drowned in a swimming pool in Dublin, and he told me his whole life flashed before him. He became very religious as a result. Again, I don't know how sincere that was, but he had that experience. Out-of-body experience is another one. People suddenly find themselves having an accident, electrocuted, and so on. A friend of mine years ago, I was in a band with him, and we were playing in this pub in Dublin, and we had a punk band at the time called the Chromosomes, and he reached over and he touched a jack on his Marshall stack, and whatever in the place it wasn't grounded, whatever was the story was, he was holding his hand on the mic stand, and there was no earthing, and he suddenly flew right back and landed on the ground, and I looked at him and he was stiff, and I started screaming, "Oh my god, he's fucking dead, he's fucking dead." And he suddenly jumped up and woke up, and he was going, "Tommy, I'm fucking alive. I was standing outside my body looking at you." And I used to, like, this is years later, I used to be, not a few years later, I used to be telling him that he was delusional, and I was sitting there reading the New Scientist magazine on neuroscience, and I was saying things like, "Here's what happened to you, Jerry. What happened was your and he used to say, "Shut the fuck up. I was floating over you, and I saw you freaking out and crying when you thought I was dead." And that's the kind of thing as well. And here was me trying desperately to be a hardcore atheist, and here was he like laughing at me because he actually had this spiritual experience. Entheogens is another one. It's an intense idea. We have to be very careful of this thing. Anyone who's followed me over the years knows that I'm very cautious about this stuff. I think it's seasonal. In my opinion, it's seasonal and it's geographically related. In every part of the world we have these substances. Stick with them. You don't have to go for the jungle juice in the Amazon. If you do, you may be risking yourself. And also the jungle juice from the Amazon taken here. Wait until September and October when the magic mushrooms show up. And then there's also incredible coincidences. We've all had them. People say this could not have happened without some kind of a spiritual, God, magical thing. And then various sort of paranormal happenings, people having dreams about, their family members dying and so on, and they died. Now we're also told these are crazy rationalizations. They're not normal. We're just filling in the gaps. And it has replaced traditional scapegoats during times of social and political upheaval. So you would have this idea of like a group who are spiritually different than I have to be attacked. At the moment it's Muslims, in the past it's been Jews. And benign substitutes for anti-Semitism, witchcraft and hidden enemies. Again, this idea of like the rationalization is we have to find someone who's not as spiritually the same as me. And therefore we validate our own spirituality by attacking someone who's not a member of our spirituality. I started this talk about the death cult in France, who attacked people who are not them, and even people within the death cult who were like in France, who were like pagans, who were not full-up members. These make fun of them. So therefore it's us against them. I validate my spirituality by attacking yours. We see that very much at the moment with American born-again Christianity. They want World War III to happen so they can bring Jesus back. They want to start wars with Jews, between Jews and Muslims, and so on. It's really a sick pathological thing. And again, it's a substitute. And then you have event hysteria, the idea that there's going to be a rapture. There's going to be something going to happen one day that's going to, like, comet clusters are going to come, and we are going to be the chosen people. And that's always throwing at Jews, but like every single cult that ever existed thinks it, from Charlie Manson up to Jonestown, up to the Comet Death cult in France, they're all the same. They think that they're the chosen people. And then there's the dogmatic need. This is an interesting one. The idea, if you grew up in a household where you're an atheist, would you, I don't know this, I'm just throwing this idea out there to the listener, would you have the same need for dogma? Would you be looking for something? If you were raised in a Jewish household, would you be looking for it? Raised in a Catholic household, would you be looking? Would you be doing that? And it's an interesting one because it makes you think, am I programmed to look for spirituality just because I hated being a Catholic or I hated being a Protestant? Does that make it any better that you became a heathen or a pagan or a Wiccan or whatever, a Satanist, whatever? That's a very interesting one. Again, all these things, it's very personal. You have to look into yourself and understand why you wanted to go on this journey. And radical atheism is born out of the same programming as well, because radical atheism is a form of dogma. It's like, I have to reject spirituality, I have to reject religion because I must practice reason. Says who? Says who? That's doomed to failure. It's very, very, it's interesting that atheism is so similar to old-time Satanism in many ways. Now, I don't have a problem with atheism, I don't have a problem with old-time Satanism. I think there's a lot of amazing stuff in there, the idea of measured thinking, but we live in an age since Richard Dawkins where we don't have rational atheism, we have radical atheism, and it's very similar. It's reactive, it's not contemplative. And we hear things about the secret and the law of attraction. I'm very dubious about these things because they're a McDonald's level of quantum physics. They're very simplified. Oh, I just have to think about what I want and it will happen. I just have to wish enough. I just have to have enough intention. I just have to have enough feelings in me. Ultimately, it's a get out of a reality card. Because if you look at anything to do with the Norse Eddas, the Hindu Vedas, the Bhagavad Gita, the book of the law, even anything to do with this, any of the main spiritual ideas, its intention goes into action. So therefore, you cannot sit at home and say, I intend to be a great actor and the universe delivers. It's not going to happen like that. You have to go to and train to be an actor. You have to go to auditions, and then the action will give in the intention. It's a 50-50 thing. The more you work towards it, the more it will come to you. It's a very beautiful idea because it forces you to evolve on a personal level. It forces you to say, to make those sacrifices. Now when I say sacrifice, I don't mean like religious sacrifice. I mean sacrificing your time to go to acting school, or if you want to be a rock star, to learn how to play a guitar, to learn how to paint a picture, to learn how to be a mechanic, to learn how to fix a car, to learn how to build a house, and then it comes towards you. It's action brings forth intention. But sitting there and going, I want this, that and the other to happen and manifest in the quantum field is absolute get out of reality card nonsense. Now, finally, why did I call this the until stole? This is a uniquely Western idea. A lot of it has come from the fact that Christianity demolished our heathen religions and left us in a state where we have no magic as such. Now, yes, you have the idea of the transubstantiation in the Catholic Church, where the priest calls down the spirit of Jesus Christ into the host and into the wine. But 99.9999% of Catholics who go to Catholic churches don't feel that. They just see some gobshite holding a cup up towards the cross during the Eucharist. They don't feel it. They don't feel it. It's because at some level the priest himself does not believe it, because the Pope himself does not believe it. Just like these TV evangelists and these mega church evangelists, they don't believe it, and cash becomes the validation for this. You have the big TV preachers who say things like, you know, give me all your money, and when they get all the money, that validates their supernatural spiritual powers. Same with the cult leaders. The cult leaders, give me all your devotion and give me all your money, and then we will have spiritual fulfillment. That's because we've lost the shaman in Western society, and we've lost the compensatory archetypes. We have lost what spiritual. You see, Europeans especially think this idea of spirituality is going through an ashram in India, going and all this nonsense. Right? It's not. You can be spiritual by telling a dirty joke in a room full of people and all of them bursting out laughing, because you've given them the gift of laughter. You've actually charged their immune system. You've made them forget the harshness of their lives. You can have a spiritual experience by writing a beautiful song and playing it. You've made them forget the mundaneness of existence, this grudging life we live, and taking them out of that. You can do that by paying a compliment to someone on the street. I mean, I try to be as complimentary as possible to people. If someone looks pretty, I'll tell them they look pretty. If someone looks beautiful, I'll tell them they look beautiful. I always share talented people's work on my Facebook page. That's a spiritual act. I don't even know if there's a life after death. I don't care. I don't even know if there's a God. I don't care. All I know is what makes me feel good is helping people to fulfill their talents. That's my sense of fulfillment. I like to take on Nazis and fascists and like other kind of archetype sexist people by cracking jokes and making fun about them. Satire. I think at some level I'm a descendant of a bard from the old days. I really do feel connected to that idea. The idea of the bard can kill the enemy with a satire. I feel that. But we've lost that. And then people will see someone like Bill Hicks or Reginald D. Hunter or Richard Pryor or George Carlin, and they'll go, wow, that guy's on the money. That's the bard. That's the shaman. That's the shaman. They've used comedy to go into the spirit world, and they've drawn real truths out and delivered them in the archetype of humor. Musicians and singers and songwriters do the same. Artists do the same. And it's in all their lives. And there's a gift in this kind of it's to the world. You could not have comedy, music, art, poetry and good times running a country, because it would be considered madness. Yet this is the gift of madness. This gift of madness, this gift of nonconformity, this antithesis to bureaucracy is what makes life worth living. If you want to go on a religious journey, the last place you should go and the last thing you should visit is a spiritual person or a spiritual leader. These are flowers which grow from within. First thing you have to do is to say to yourself is, how do I explore myself as a spiritual person? And you think about the things you did in your life that have lit up people's faces. When you paid a compliment to your child and said, you're really great at that football game today, and you saw the skin light up, their eyes light up. That's a spiritual experience. When you see someone who's really talented and they really hit you right there in your heart, that's a spiritual experience. When you have that stuff grounded and when you have that stuff fulfilled, then you're ready for what they call the secret journey, the mystical engagement, the journey to a spiritual fulfillment. Then you have a soul that's waiting to be tilled. You have an untilled soul if you have this superficiality, this I have to do what the guru says, I have to follow this political dogma, I have to follow this idea. That's the untilled soul. And you can always tell a person, like I said at the beginning, without a soul. Now, I'm not going to say they can never have a soul. I'm just saying the soul is gone. They have the glazed over dead look in their eyes. They're repeating what some guru or cult leader told them. There's no vitality or spark in them. There's nothing there. Nothing. You see that in these Pentecostal and others born again churches. There's nothing there. They talk about the rapture, they hold one hand up in the air and sing about Jesus. They don't mean any of it. It's all a drug. It's all dopamine and serotonin. But when you see a genuine connection, a genuine spark, it's amazing. It's absolutely amazing. I can remember years ago when I was a young lad, and there was I was working as a house painter in New York, in Queens, in Forest Hills, and we had to go paint these houses. And there was this very, very old lady. She must have been 80 plus, maybe close to 90 years old. She was bent over, ancient, and she was an old Irish lady and could barely could take care of herself. We were painting her house, and my boss was American, in New York, Queens, like typical guy. And she came to the door and she said, "Oh, you're the house painters." And I said something like, "Is it okay if we park the van over there?" And when she heard my Irish accent, I'm not kidding you, it was like 50 years was taken off her, and a wry smile appeared on her face. Because just my simple act of saying that in an Irish accent reminded her of what she was and where she came from. And that is a true spiritual experience.